All right, well let's get this thing going. So been a bit since I've done a video, been busy with work, had to travel a bit, and then this week I found out that my freezer went out, and unfortunately my freezer had not gone out this week. So lost everything in it, which was about 100 pounds of high quality meat. That's a bit of a bummer. It also included the two deer I got last fall. So uh, that hurts my heart because that means no more deer meat until, I guess, probably December by the time I'm able to hunt and get stuff processed again. So man, it's been one. So this video talking about the smoker again, which I know there's some people probably like, holy crap, again. Well, still got problems and we're working on it. So in this video, I'm looking at the probe, and I think I've got figured out what kind of probe they're using. So if you haven't watched those and for some reason you are interested in this, I made a couple videos on this, right? Did a video on the smoker itself, then it started having problems with the probe, and so the probe's completely failed and the smoker is currently unusable. Been going back and forth with Masterbuilt. They can't get me another probe until June. It's a whole deal. So I've been doing testing, and there's been some indicators while I've been working on this thing of what type of probe they're using. It's definitely not an RTD. It's not a PT100. It's not a thermistor. It does appear to be a thermocouple. So the first clue is if you look at the barrel connector, and they are using these weird twist lock barrel connectors, the connector for the thermal probe is yellow. Now, in the United States, the Type K thermocouple connectors are color-coded as yellow. The other thing, before we get too far, I'll point out is the type of barrel jack, because if you do need to replace yours, it is important to get the right connector. They're using a 5.5 millimeter barrel jack with a 2.5 millimeter internal pin for the thermal probe. For the 12 volt input, it's the same 5.5 millimeter jack, but the internal pin is, I believe, a 2.1 millimeter pin. And that means that they're not interchangeable. You can't use the same connector. So for the thermal probe, you will need the bigger internal pin diameter, or else you won't be able to get the jack in. I guess what that does is it does mean that you can't put the 12 volt input into the thermal interface, which is probably a good thing. The next thing is if you look at the older model Gravity series, the controllers are all made by the same company, and they use a Type K thermocouple. So with that, if you think about it from the manufacturer side of things, it makes very little sense to use a different thermal probe for these controllers. And that Chinese manufacturer of these things, again, they've already got all the hardware sorted, they've got the coding, they've got the internal kind of translation from the probe to temperature and all that stuff already figured out. Why use a different one? The last thing that I'll talk about is whenever you open up the PCB cover and look at the PCB where the wires go in, for the connector itself, the two wires are yellow and red. And on a Type K thermocouple in the United States, the wires are yellow and red. And so that makes a lot of sense. Another thing, if you ever want to check a thermocouple to figure out what type you've got, beyond all that stuff. So if you take a magnet to the wires on a Type K thermocouple, one of the wires will actually have a bit of a magnetic pull to it, or at least it'll be a bit ferrous, so it will be affected by the magnet a little bit. So there are other thermocouples that do have that property, but again, it just kind of drives home, look, the color coding on the connector, the color coding on the wires, and the fact that that's what they were using with their older model. So I got some thermocouples and tested, and sure enough, that looks like what they're using. So if you need to replace yours, I would get a Type K thermocouple. You'll need one that's at least 30 inches, so get something maybe a meter long. That way you can cut it down. Get some of those 5.5 millimeter barrel jacks with a 2.5 millimeter internal pin diameter. And the ones I got just have screw terminals because I just wanted to do some testing. You probably do want to get one that can be soldered. You also want to be really careful. These wires are not stranded, and just as an aside on thermocouples, because the way they work, you can't just put any random wire extension. That's why you want to get one that's longer than you need. That way you can cut it down, because if you use copper wires on the lead, they won't work as well. There's actually a bit of an offset that's built into the controllers because the way a thermocouple works, it produces really tiny voltages, like 1 to 5 to 10 millivolts. This is really, really small. And so they're very sensitive to like the leads. If you get an extension, it has to be made out of the correct wires, and they're solid wires, not stranded, which means if you work them much, they'll crack and break really easily. I think that's probably what happened to mine is it got bent and kind of tight kinked somewhere. And so I think that's what's caused the original probe to have problems. But get your probe, cut it down to the right length with your connector, and it should work. The other thing I'll say is you can fish these things through the little port in the side without too much problems if you get one that's not too long. So I got these little short ones. They're like 2.5 inches long and maybe, I don't know, few millimeters around like a 1/8 or maybe 3/16 diameter. And they're pretty easy to fish through that side port without problems. But that's kind of it. Now, we'll say it is frustrating that Masterbuilt does this stuff. They've used this special like little twist lock connector, that barrel jack, and those are really hard to find. I have seen some people on eBay selling them, but they're the wrong internal pin. And then I found a Chinese manufacturer on Alibaba that will make them, but I haven't ordered any because, you'd have to get them molded in. But all this to say, why aren't they just using the regular thermocouple interface? Because that's what they were using on the older models. So why did they switch? And it could be because those little twist locks have a little bit better environmental protection from like weather and water, but I don't know. It makes it harder to change out for sure. And the other thing that really frustrates me is that they wouldn't just tell me to get a K-type thermocouple for this thing. The reason that frustrates me is because they're out of stock, right? They don't have these things. They say it's going to be June to get what is a bog standard thermocouple. Like Type K is the most common thermocouple, I think, and even to the point where my Fluke multimeter will use a Type K thermocouple. Like, they're everywhere. You can get 3 of these for 15 bucks off of Amazon, and they're out of stock until June. And they were fine with me sitting here without a smoker that I paid, what, $1,600 for this thing for months with it not working because, well, we don't want you to modify your machine by using the thermocouple that you can get anywhere for dirt cheap. That leaves a bad taste in my mouth, obviously. And finding out that, well, that's what they're using, a bit frustrating to be sure. Last thing on these, whenever you put in your new thermocouple, it'll take a bit for the temperature on the controller to read correctly. The controllers that they're using, they really heavily smooth that temperature readout. And so whenever the temperature changes, they really lag the temperature change quite a bit. And I've tested these versus my Fireboard. The Fireboard's just way more responsive. They do end up being fairly accurate. And so I've found them anywhere like 5 to 10 degrees, maybe 20 if you're at a really high temperature, but that's still like less than 10% error. So that's probably because I'm not using the right connector. And like I said, they can be sensitive even to the metal leads. And what they have to do is they program an offset into the controller because they actually are trying to read the temperature at the junction where the leads turn into copper on like the PCB. And I think, if you actually look at the leads going to the PCB, they're also using that thermocouple wire because of that. And me putting in some rando, cheapo connector that I got off of Amazon probably throws that calibration off just a little. But that's it. That's all you got to do to replace these things. And I don't want to make this video, too long because there's no need for that. But that's all I got to say. If you got any feedback, comments, or suggestions, leave them down below. But otherwise, I appreciate your time.